No one in the crowded terminal understood the meaning of the tiny gesture that happened near Gate 18 that evening. But for one powerful man watching from across the waiting area, it was a signal that would unravel a dangerous secret and change the fate of everyone involved. The airport was loud with the ordinary rhythm of travel. Rolling suitcases rattling across polished floors, flight announcements echoing through high ceilings, families rushing toward boarding lines. But Lucian Moretti, a 38-year-old man whose name quietly carried weight in certain circles along the East Coast, moved through the terminal with the calm attention of someone trained to notice what others ignored. To most travelers, he looked like nothing special. Dark coat, simple luggage, the posture of a businessman waiting for a delayed flight. But Lucian had built his reputation on a skill far more valuable than power or money. He could read people. Years in a dangerous world had taught him that the smallest movements often revealed the biggest truths, and that was why the young woman caught his attention the moment she appeared from the security corridor. She looked no older than 19, walking slowly beside a tall man who kept his hand wrapped tightly around her upper arm as if guiding her, but not quite trusting her to walk alone. Around her neck was a rigid medical brace, the kind worn after serious injuries, and although she tried to keep her posture steady, there was a careful stiffness in every step she took. A faint bruise darkened the edge of her cheekbone, half hidden beneath strands of brown hair that had been hurriedly tied back. The man beside her scanned the terminal frequently, not like a tourist searching for a gate number, but like someone measuring every stranger who crossed his path, and Lucian noticed the difference immediately. Suspicion was second nature to him. Survival had demanded it. He lowered the lid of his laptop slightly, pretending to check a message while his attention followed the pair moving through the crowd. The girl never looked around much. Her gaze stayed forward, her expression controlled, almost numb, but there was tension in the way she held her hands together, the kind of tension that only appeared when someone was trying very hard not to show fear. Then, as they passed within a few feet of Lucian's seat, something happened so quickly that nearly everyone in the terminal missed it. The young woman lifted her hand slightly, as if adjusting the sleeve of her sweater, and for less than a second 2 fingers tapped lightly against the inside of her wrist before her hand dropped back to her side. It was subtle, so subtle that to anyone else it looked meaningless, but Lucian saw it clearly. His eyes sharpened as the pair continued walking toward the far end of the terminal. The girl never turned her head, never acknowledged him. But the signal had been deliberate. Lucian knew signals like that. They were used by people who couldn't speak openly, by people who needed help without alerting the person controlling them. For a moment he remained perfectly still, letting the noise of the terminal wash around him while his mind replayed the movement again and again. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a nervous habit. But something about the scene didn't fit the ordinary pattern of travel. The man's grip on her arm was too firm. The bruise on her cheek was too fresh, and the fear hidden behind her calm expression felt too real to ignore. Lucian slowly closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, pretending to relax while his eyes followed the pair as they paused near a digital departure screen. The man leaned closer to the girl and spoke quietly, his tone sharp enough that even from a distance Lucian could sense the authority in it. She nodded quickly, as if agreeing to instructions she had heard many times before. Travelers flowed past them in every direction. Families arguing about luggage, businessmen rushing to catch connections, children chasing each other between rows of seats, yet none of them noticed the tension standing quietly in the middle of the terminal. That was the strange thing about danger, Lucian often thought. It could exist in plain sight while the world continued moving around it without realizing. The pair began walking again, heading toward a boarding corridor that led to several domestic gates. Lucian watched them disappear into the moving crowd, his instincts tightening like a knot in his chest. Over the years he had learned to trust those instincts more than logic, because logic sometimes made people ignore the warnings right in front of them. Instinct, however, rarely lied. He stood slowly, picking up his small carry-on bag as if preparing for an ordinary flight, but his attention remained fixed on the direction the two had gone. The image of the girl's brief gesture stayed sharp in his memory. 2 fingers, a tap against the wrist, a movement meant to be unnoticed, and yet she had made sure he could see it. That detail alone told him something important. The signal had not been random. She had chosen him, perhaps because he was the only person watching carefully enough to understand, or perhaps because something about him suggested he was capable of helping. Either way, the message had been delivered. As Lucian walked toward the corridor where the pair had disappeared, he thought about the many situations he had encountered during his years navigating a world where power, loyalty, and violence often mixed together in dangerous ways. He had seen people hide fear behind smiles, watched criminals pretend to be victims, and witnessed innocent people trapped in circumstances they never chose. But there was something about the quiet desperation in that girl's eyes that felt unmistakably genuine. When he reached the corner leading toward the boarding gates, he slowed slightly, scanning the area until he spotted them again near the entrance to Gate 22. The man stood close beside her, speaking with a gate agent, while keeping one hand firmly on her shoulder as if reminding her not to move. The girl stared at the floor, silent and still, yet as Lucian watched from across the terminal, she shifted slightly, and for the briefest moment her gaze lifted. Their eyes met across the distance. It lasted less than a second, just long enough for Lucian to see the fear she had been trying to hide. Then she looked away again, her expression returning to the same careful calm she had worn before. Lucian exhaled slowly, realizing that whatever situation she was in, she had taken a risk by sending that signal. And once someone like him noticed a signal like that, pretending it never happened was no longer an option. Because sometimes the smallest gesture in a crowded airport could reveal a story far darker than anyone nearby realized. And whether he wanted it or not, Lucian Moretti had just become part of it. Lucian Moretti knew the moment he saw the girl's eyes across the terminal that the signal hadn't been accidental. And once he understood that, ignoring it was no longer an option. Everything around Gate 22 still looked normal. Passengers lining up with boarding passes, the quiet hum of conversations, the steady announcements echoing across the airport. But Lucian's attention stayed fixed on the tall man standing beside the 19-year-old girl who had silently asked for help only minutes earlier. The man kept his hand resting firmly on her shoulder as they moved forward in the boarding line, a gesture that looked casual to anyone else, but carried clear control behind it. The girl's movements were careful and restrained, her posture stiff because of the medical brace around her neck, and the fading bruise on her cheek made the entire scene feel even more wrong. Lucian stepped into the boarding line a few passengers behind them, blending into the slow-moving crowd as his mind quietly worked through possibilities. Situations like this were rarely simple. Sometimes fear meant a family dispute, sometimes it meant someone escaping trouble, and sometimes it meant something much darker. As they reached the gate agent, the man answered every question himself, speaking quickly before the girl could say a single word. She kept her eyes lowered the entire time, silent until they were waved through the jet bridge. Lucian followed moments later, moving calmly down the narrow boarding hallway and onto the aircraft. Inside the plane, passengers shuffled down the aisle, lifting bags and settling into their seats. Lucian quickly spotted the pair near the rear of the cabin. The man had chosen the aisle seat, placing himself between the girl and the rest of the plane, a small decision that made it harder for her to move or speak without him noticing. Lucian continued past them until he reached his seat several rows ahead, placing his bag overhead before sitting down casually. From there he could still see them if he glanced toward the back of the cabin. As the aircraft began taxiing down the runway, Lucian leaned back as if relaxing for an ordinary flight, but his attention never truly left the pair behind him. The girl kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers occasionally trembling before she forced them still again. The man remained alert, scanning the cabin every few minutes as if he expected someone to be watching. About 30 minutes into the flight, the man finally stood up and walked toward the restroom at the back of the plane. The moment he disappeared behind the curtain, Lucian sensed the shift he had been waiting for. A few seconds later, the girl carefully lifted her head despite the stiffness of her neck brace and scanned the cabin until her eyes found Lucian. The fear in her expression was unmistakable now. Slowly, she raised her hand above her lap and repeated the same movement she had made in the airport, two fingers tapping lightly against her wrist. This time the gesture was slower and more deliberate, like a message she needed to make sure he understood. Lucian gave the smallest nod in response, barely noticeable to anyone else, but the girl saw it immediately. For just a moment, relief flashed across her face before she quickly lowered her hand and stared forward again. When the man returned a few seconds later, she looked exactly as he had left her, silent and still. But Lucian understood something important now. The signal wasn't random. It carried a meaning he recognized from years spent dealing with dangerous people and desperate situations. On being forced. I can't speak. Please understand. Asterisk. And now that he knew the truth, the quiet flight moving through the night sky was no longer just another trip between cities. It had become the beginning of something far more serious, and Lucian Moretti was already planning what would happen the moment the plane touched the ground. By the time the plane finally began its descent, Lucian Moretti had already decided what needed to happen next. From the outside, the flight had been completely uneventful. Passengers watched movies, some slept, others chatted quietly. But Lucian's attention never strayed far from the pair seated several rows behind him. The man remained tense the entire flight, rarely relaxing, while the girl sat in silence with her hands folded tightly in her lap, careful not to draw attention to herself. Yet Lucian knew the truth now. The signal she had given him meant she was being forced, and once someone like him understood that message, ignoring it simply wasn't an option. As the aircraft touched down and passengers began standing to retrieve their luggage, Lucian stayed seated, watching carefully. The tall man rose first and immediately placed a firm hand on the girl's arm, guiding her into the slow-moving line toward the exit. She didn't resist, but the fear in her eyes returned the moment the cabin doors opened. When they stepped into the airport terminal, the crowd moved forward in the usual rush of arriving travelers. That was when Lucian quietly stepped aside and made a short phone call. He spoke only a few calm sentences before ending the call and slipping his phone back into his pocket. To anyone nearby, it looked like nothing important. But Lucian Moretti didn't make ordinary phone calls. By the time the man and the girl reached the main terminal corridor, 2 airport security officers were already approaching from the opposite direction. At first the man didn't notice them, but when he finally did, Lucian saw the reaction instantly. The slight pause, the tightening of his grip on the girl's arm. Guilty people always noticed authority faster than anyone else. One officer stepped forward politely and asked the man to stop for a moment. The man immediately began arguing, claiming there must be some mistake, but his voice carried the nervous edge of someone who knew the situation was slipping out of his control. That was when the girl finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost trembling, but the words were clear enough for the officers to hear. Please don't let him take me. In an instant the situation changed. The officers separated them, guiding the girl gently away while the man began protesting louder, his calm mask finally cracking under pressure. Within seconds more security personnel arrived, and the man was escorted away while the girl remained surrounded by people asking if she was safe. Lucian didn't stay to watch the rest unfold. He simply walked past the scene like another traveler heading toward baggage claim. The girl never saw him leave, but that didn't matter. Some rescues didn't require introductions, and some heroes preferred to remain invisible. As Lucian stepped into the busy terminal and disappeared into the moving crowd, the only thing that remained behind was the small signal that had started it all. 2 fingers tapping against a wrist in the middle of a crowded airport, and the decision of one man who chose not to ignore it.